Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
I'm Kevin Bayuk, a partner and worker owner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Shari Davis. Shari leads with an amazing team to advance the mission of the Participatory Budgeting Project, to empower people to decide together how public money is spent. She has an interesting background of vocational work that I'd love to learn more about prior to joining the Participatory Budgeting Project team, with nearly 15 years of service and leadership in local government, including work as Director of Youth Engagement and Employment for the City of Boston, and as the citywide Neighborhood Safety Coordinator on the Boston Mayor's Youth Council and working at the Mayor's Youth Line. And if I read it right, that's also during high school, which blows my mind. So I'm very curious to learn more about that. Shari is a graduate of Boston University's Sargent College for Health and Rehabilitation Sciences and holds a master's degree in anatomy and physiology. Shari, welcome to the podcast.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me.
Definitely our pleasure. And I'd love it if we could start just with a little of your story. What is your path that got you into the work you're doing today? And you could take that any direction you want, start at any moment, and take as long as you need.
Well, thank you for asking. I think this question about journeys is so important, and for us to kind of share our journeys to things is a really special thing. And for me, my journey was interesting and maybe a little bit exciting even. It started as a martial artist, actually. As a young person, my father used to joke that I just always wanted to do karate. And in the living room, he would, quote, train me. And when I was 9 years old, I had a chance to actually study martial arts at a community center in Boston. And I loved it. And I found it so powerful to be on the floor discovering what was possible with my body, or maybe defying what I thought was possible the day before. And with practice, things were changing. And I actually became a young instructor. When I was 10, I started teaching karate classes. And when I was 11, I started teaching more. And adults used to come to the class. And I started teaching at other community centers, not just the one that I started training at. And through this journey in my adolescence of becoming a sensei, an instructor, and in that tradition of martial arts that I grew up in, there was so much community responsibility. There was so much that you were supposed to maybe think about or honor in shared space together. And that was kind of my foundation of thinking about public service, of thinking about radical change, of thinking about how one can actually study ways in which we as individuals can change, how we can stand next to each other and work toward change side by side. And that kind of took me into government. I got a summer job as a karate instructor through a mayor's office program, and slowly found my way then working in the mayor's office as a teenager and doing the same thing, thinking about ways in which I might transform what's possible or what I thought was possible, and standing alongside other folks who were really interested in changing the system, maybe from the inside out or maybe from the outside in, right at the same time. It didn't feel like a binary conversation or challenge in the circles and organizing circles that I started growing up in and growing from. And so all of this said, my journey that started with martial arts was really a doorway for me to think about systems of change and take that into local government through my summer job, take that into what I did with studying science and medicine at Boston University, and now really take that into this system change in a big way at the Participatory Budgeting Project as a shared leader, right? We don't have sole executive directors. We have co-executive directors. And I think that's important when we live our values and work side by side people that are building a practice of embodying and working toward radical change as we work toward changing the way that people do business and think about making decisions together that affect folks. So that's a little bit of what the journey has looked like.
I love it. There's so many themes in there that I want to revisit in this conversation, if possible, around practice and how change happens and how transformation happens. So much in your lived experience that can inform the larger aspects of our society. I'm wondering if maybe first, for those of our audience that might be new to participatory budgeting as a concept, I'm wondering, because I think that's going to be a big part of our conversation, could you educate us all? Like, what is participatory budgeting? How does it work? And why does it excite you?
Participatory budgeting, well, one is exciting because I think it can be incredibly powerful. And what it is exactly is a bit of a framework or practice in making decisions together about public dollars. Really, it's a process where community comes together to directly decide how public money is spent. And that can happen in an institution, it can happen in government. And it's a practice that started in Brazil, actually. And one of the biggest celebrated outcomes of community members in Brazil really making decisions about how tax dollars were spent, it reduced infant mortality rate. It had these big impacts on social determinants of health.
Very interesting. So it actually changed. So that's part of change. When people think about participatory budgeting and then how it fits into systems change as a broad concept, how would you respond to somebody who says, how is this going to help transform the way the government works or outcomes for my life or my community's life?
Well, maybe just backing up a touch more, the way that government decision-making about public budgets works now is typically a person or a small group of people make some guesses, maybe on the expenses from the last year. Maybe they're even really educated guesses around what the expenses that could be incurred in a calendar year are. They put those guesses or estimates forward to another group of people, or maybe even one person. And sometimes a city council can vote down pieces of that budget, but ultimately it's refined and usually largely passed in that same form that kind of came up. Now, I think when budgeting works best, there is deep community involvement, right? Folks closest to the issues have an opportunity to really craft, draft, and invest in those solutions. And participatory budgeting offers that opportunity. It's a process where communities come together first and write the rules transparently that may govern a process so that everyone is bought in, everyone is clear on what's happening, and the rules may actually be customized to the community so that they make sense. It's about a process that lives and breathes with the community in the same way that people live and breathe. And I think after we're able to do this kind of design phase that's integrated this way, we're able to move into an ideation phase. What are the ideas that people have? What are the issues that you see? How do we honor your lived experience as an expert that's lived in this space, that's been a part of an institution? What do you recognize? And after we move through that ideation bit, we're able to then refine those ideas, develop concrete proposals, really think about need, feasibility, and impact. And I spend time describing this moment of participatory budgeting, this opportunity to refine proposals, because I think it's really special. Sure, people are building relationships across institutions, which I think is great. And I also think that folks have an opportunity to really access some knowledge around how these things work, maybe even demystify some of these systems, if you will, and then participate in shaping them. That's what happens in proposal development when folks are able to work alongside each other and practice not only imagining what different looks like, but what we need to get there. After those proposals are developed and vetted, the community actually votes, weighs in, and makes decisions on how funds would be spent after that transparent information is displayed in a ballot. And one of the things that I love about the way that PV votes happen, as opposed to traditional local or national elections, is that barriers are reduced. oftentimes people that live, work, or play in an area are eligible to engage in deciding how funds are spent in that space in a PB process. And I think that that is revolutionary in terms of access, in terms of community building, in terms of how decisions are informed, in terms of how a community can show up in relationship to the outcomes of those decisions. So if a community says, you know what, we really want to prioritize this investment, this renovation in our park, because it will allow us to meet some of the needs that we have. That's only true if the community knows about it, if they can actually use it, if it's designed to meet their needs. The same thing is true about housing investments. The same thing is true about investments to curb or stop or repair from displacement, right? And I think that like, you can't answer questions around what community members really need unless they're involved in the design, the proposal development, the ideation, the decisions, and then evaluating that process. And that is what participatory budgeting offers. And I think it's pretty different than the way that typical budget decisions are made now.
To my mind, it seems not necessarily orthogonal, but just completely different. You use the word revolutionary. Is I think rhetorically, some people might say, well, government is democracy, the representational government as it is today, and those guesses are, there is an engagement, like you said, but when we critique it, oftentimes we'll see that level of engagement that exists normally today is either tokenizing, sometimes tokenizing at best, sometimes it's just pure rhetoric. There's not the community voice is marginalized, ignored, again, or just maybe present in these late stages, not in the design, not in the ideation, not in the crafting. And so what you're describing is something that I agree, it seems completely different. And I think it might be responding to when we talk to people about getting involved in systems change or getting involved in government, there's a lot of disillusionment and apathy. Voices have been shut down, marginalized for so long. And, a white supremacist, racist culture has excluded so many people from any involvement in determining what happens in our community, in the community for so long, for generations, that how do you even start to enroll people in saying, let's try it on? What's the first stages to get a community involved in PB, to even get excited about it?
Well, I really appreciate the fact that you kind of name this thing that sometimes is hard for folks to overcome, this disillusionment, or the fact that when we talk about government and systems change, some folks and many folks, especially Black and brown folks, intersectional folks, are showing up to that conversation maybe with a personal story of harm that's directly correlated to that system, that's in relationship to that. And so the ask is like, hey, can you show up and do systems change? And maybe we'll address a whole history of harm. Maybe we'll steamroll over that. And maybe folks' experience has been time and time again that they've been asked to engage in a consultative process that will allow for radical community change, or they've been asked for their opinion simply and ignored, or they've tried to offer their opinion and been ignored. And I think when you ask this question around disillusionment, like how do you combat that and how do you start a healthy conversation around engagement? I think the first step is to acknowledge that what has happened so far and what people's experience maybe has been. And I think you have to design with that in mind. And you can't design with that in mind without people. You can't design with that in mind without folks that were impacted by the justice system. You can't design with that in mind without folks that have been in this relationship with government that has been really difficult, right? And if we are going to change that, I think it starts with like acknowledging that and building some capacity toward change. And so that said, I think there are some important conditions when we think about radical shifts. And if we're going to build the next economy now, we have to build for the conditions, not that we're trying to create at this moment, but those future conditions, and then begin practicing them right now in this moment. And I think that that means first being able to build from the bottom up, but that's not a binary choice. When we build with community and we build campaigns towards something, I think that there needs to be a long game strategy of not only envisioning the win, but building the infrastructure for after we've won. So if we're fighting right now for the opportunity for community members to shape their own destiny, we have to build that infrastructure now. Sure, we have to build campaigns toward that. We have to resource campaigns toward that. And so I do think that a big part of it is a long game strategy. And the other side isn't perfect. It's much better than what we're engaging with now. It will allow us to save lives. And I think that that's why acknowledgement of people's experience, of our ancestors' experience, is important, not only in the healing, but in building systems, future systems now that are going to work and be flexible enough to build with us and to respond to, I think, what has been like an ongoing assault of white supremacy in most people's interactions with government, especially if they're Black and brown. I think that's what it requires. It has to start with some deep acknowledgement. It has to be designed with folks that have been impacted at the core and center. And then it has to be real, right? Like when I'm talking about participatory budgeting, I'm not talking about fictitious processes somewhere. I'm talking about thousands of instances across the globe where community members have been successful in mobilizing millions of dollars toward community need. And I think that not only can it happen at scale, but it really should. And I think communities can customize that so that that future that we're thinking about, we can begin practicing it right now. And so I think that's what it requires. It's hard work. And I think it does have to start with acknowledging our history so that we can build a future.
And that's the starting point. And it has to be community first, people driven, and that we have to have the acknowledgement of present and historical harms. For those listeners who might be like, this sounds good, and you just referenced, that there are thousands of instances. This is not science fiction. You mentioned Brazil earlier, but I'm wondering, could you further ground through either your lived experience or all your colleagues and teammates in your organization, or that you've been witness to or facilitated? Is there any stories that you want to share about? Here, participatory budgeting, it's real, and here's how it worked. This is what happened with a community. Just curious if there's anything that comes to mind.
There are so many. And maybe to offer just a little bit of context at scale and then zoom into an example or two, I think participatory budgeting as a practice in the United States has been around for something like 10 years. But globally, it's a bit over 30 years old. And so there are so many examples and stories to draw from. In the United States alone, we've seen something like $300 million be decided on by over 400,000 community members. And that is an example of like some collective decision making and being able to mobilize funds in that way. I think the other thing to just name is there are so many stories because we've seen over 16,000 projects be decided on by community through participatory budgeting across the United States. And the doors are opening for that to mean even more projects that are decided on by community, or really more decisions that are made by community members. And some of my kind of favorite instances and examples of that are happening right now, are campaigns that are being like won and fought right now. And I'll tell you one story about Vallejo, California. And I think this is important because this was the United States' first instance of citywide participatory budgeting. This happened several years ago. But one important factor is that the city of Vallejo had just declared bankruptcy. And so this was a moment when there was an all-time distrust in government in that community. And I think there was a real decision made with some future thinking to say, well, what do we need to do to repair relationships, demonstrate that we're able to build trust and build some fiscal responsibility in the ways that we move forward? And they instituted a multi-million-dollar PB process. And not only was it successful in distributing funds, but they were able to really roll out a tax measure that allowed folks that community members voted on because it coincided with PB. And so it increased revenue for the city. It allowed folks to engage in the decision making that was a result of that revenue increase. And really begin to repair some of the relationships between community and government, right? So that we're not talking across the table, but actually able to stand side by side each other in practice toward repair, healing, and reinvestment. And so I bring up that story of Vallejo because since then, we've seen so many instances of participatory budgeting in schools where young people have made decisions around school district dollars to meet their needs. We've seen this in New York City, where young people are saying, hey, voters of New York City made a decision to change the city charter. And yes, we recognize that there maybe are some stalling elements of this with COVID-19, but how do we honor and move forward this process of community reinvestment if voters have made an amendment to the city charter? And how can we as young people begin to engage people in the planning process of the relaunch of participatory budgeting at scale in New York City? And so I can give you these examples of not only instances where communities have really come together to repair trust, but even now, in this moment when we're thinking about the pressures and challenges that exist in moments of fiscal constraint, folks are coming together to say, how can we use deliberative community process to make decisions on how we move forward, even if something maybe has shown a hiccup, or maybe it actually needs an injection of deep community support? How can we use processes like PB or participatory democracy to get them going again? And so I say all that, and maybe it's a bit of macro examples of PB, but I think it's pretty powerful. The last thing I'll say that I'm noticing across the country with participatory budgeting right now is that there are so many folks and data, right, that says system, like the carceral system, is causing harm. Like, I don't think that I or anyone else needs to describe that any further. And the next question is, well, what's next? And one of the things that I think is beautiful about the organizing that I'm noticing across the country, in Seattle and LA, is that part of what's next is communities making decisions. And so there are big campaigns that are being won in these spaces led by folks in Seattle like the Black Brilliance Project to really divest from systems of harm and ensure that community members can invest in alternatives to safety that don't look like policing. And so I name all that to say, I think that's where I'm seeing movement and excitement with participatory budgeting. And as I say it out loud, maybe to some folks, it sounds like science fiction, but it's actually so real and so happening right now and so designed by community members that have been impacted by so many things that what gets me the most excited is what's possible. I can't wait for you to ask me this question a year from now as some folks really begin to embark on this journey at scale. And I hope when you do, I'm able to tell you about many more instances of folks doing participatory budgeting together.
Great examples. And I very likely will call you up on that and ask you that question, just because I think we need to make these things real. At Lift Economy, we have the privilege of working with a number of multi-stakeholder cooperatives and cooperative organizations within communities that do some type of deliberative collective decision making, allocate resources within their organization or their enterprise opportunity. And those of us in the community working on Next Economy type organizations, not necessarily public, municipal, incorporated entities or areas or communities when we talk about government, sometimes people think of that, but governance in terms of organizations, some people will hear what we're talking about and they'll say, okay, I'm values aligned with that, but isn't, it's kind of a straw man question, isn't deliberation hard? How do you get the ideation and the refining of the proposals to get something to a place where we can make a decision or vote or come to consent or consensus on something? For many people, they get stalled out. They're like, that's messy. They're scared of it, I think. Some people will admit that. They've tried it maybe in some context and maybe it was difficult. Does that bring up anything for you from the experiences that you have at the project? And I'm curious what you'd share maybe in response to them.
Yeah, so your question is deep community engagement, is collective decision-making difficult? Sure, but I think that the right question, or maybe a different question to ask, is how do we do democracy well, right? And what is our purpose here? And is our purpose to really be able to engage and shape decisions and build communities that are healthy and reflective of the individuals in them and meet people's needs and offer dignity, right, to the folks that live in certain space? And if that's true, then I think that the question becomes, well, how do we do that? And does it require resources? Yes. Does it require intentionality? Yes. And if the question is, well, then why? Or can you explain the rationale of the resource investment? And it's because it's better, right? I mean, I remember the first time I had an opportunity to really learn about participatory budgeting, like most people, was by doing it in the city of Boston. And I remember thinking as it was happening, wow, as a staff member, and at the time I worked in local government and I was one of the sole staff members responsible for managing a process wherein thousands of young people would make a decision about how $1 million of the city of Boston's capital funds were spent in that fiscal year. I will be the first to admit that I thought that this was a tall order, and maybe I was a little bit nervous about how I would make this happen. And what I found was, on the other side, things that strengthen my practice in public service. So what I found was, yes, it took a little bit more planning of coordinating across team interactions or an across team meeting. And I also found that most people in government didn't actually know the individuals that worked across the hall or down the hall from them or in a different department. And so having a cross department meeting was, yes, a little bit more work, but now after that, everyone knew each other and could engage and work actually a little bit more seamlessly. So I would say that there is an initial learning curve, an initial investment that's required of skill building, of facilitation, of maybe doing things a little bit differently. But the other side of it actually is a reduction in the burden on staff that are trying to build and foster deep connections that are sustainable. It's an opportunity to really grow community engagement in ways that work and are effective. And so the short answer to your question is it more work? Yes, but I think the question has to be, what is the kind of work we need to do to get where we're going? And I would argue that the system that we have now, the way that we're doing business right now, isn't working, is really ineffective, and it actually requires the deep time investment of not only folks that work in the system, but folks that we want to participate in a functional system. We have to design for that, and it is a difference in the way that we do business.
I love everything about what you just shared. I think it's very important, and made me think of even your experience in the living room, practicing the martial arts, and actually then reflecting and seeing change happen. And we're new 10 years in the United States, 30 years old as a practice, this type of direct participation in the context of our modern world. This is something that we're not going to be skilled at day one. So it's going to require training and practice resources. We shouldn't anticipate necessarily that change will happen right away. Then you reflected on the payoffs that would come if we're patient and committed and invested in these practices. That was something I hadn't thought of recently, is like you said, the people who are making those guesses, maybe bad guesses or maybe influenced guesses, influenced by special interests or whoever has captured government at the time. But those guesses, there's a pressure to make good guesses if they ostensibly care about their constituents or the community, and taking the burden of the guessing off of the representatives of democracy or the functionaries of government by facilitating a true direct participatory experience. It has a long tail effect of not only a spillover into society at large, but then making government more trusting and relational. Are we seeing some of that occur where more trust is built up?
I think so. And I mean, I know so. But I guess one thing that I would say is I wouldn't frame it as reducing the burden of folks that work in government to make decisions, but I would frame it instead as folks in government There's no shortage of decisions that are going to be made, right? And they're really important decisions. But maybe there is an approach here that looks like seeing folks that work in these institutions as facilitators of good decisions. And good decisions don't come behind a closed door or from one individual, but instead we're able to make really good decisions when we have avenues to inject some collective intelligence into those decisions, right? We're smarter together. There's no disagreement about that. And so how do we make some decisions to facilitate good process, make some decisions to facilitate transparency, make some decisions to facilitate trust? And I think that happens not just with PB, but with approaches around participatory democracy, period, right? How do we begin to think about the machine of policy? And here's an example for you, not just as something that happens with folks behind a closed door, but how do we begin to think about participatory policymaking, right? Opportunities for us to make some decisions together. And sure, maybe we're sharing some of the burden of that decision, but actually we're building some civic muscle. We're educating folks. We're actually getting closer to the next iteration of policy after this one because we've had so many individuals involved. So didn't we just build capacity towards change significantly and more efficiently than we would if one person wrestled with one thing with a small group of people behind a closed door? And so I think this point of burden is really interesting. And I think what's interesting about it is difference, right? I think that, again, one of the big barriers when folks say, that sounds really interesting, it also sounds really hard, maybe I won't do it, is how do we begin to make some decisions to build the skill set for us to do things differently? I think so often about foundations that are doing maybe really good work and investing in really wonderful work out in the world. But I often have this question of like, well, what are the internal practices that you're bringing in to the way that you do business because of what you value out in the world, right? And if you value and see the importance of investing in systems change, in democracy, in these approaches, well, how do we model that and build our own internal capacity for change on that level as we walk into the world, right? And so I think that this bit about burden is so interesting. And I think I just see it as an opportunity. And I'm not going to say that seizing an opportunity is always easy, right? But I do think it is better. It is expansive. And I don't think we've scratched the surface of what participatory democracy allows in terms of innovation. I think we have a pretty good picture of what closed door democracy allows. I think we have seen the vision there. And I think if we build capacity towards something else, a much more vibrant, I think, relationship between all of us and the decisions we make in government can emerge.
I have a lot of faith and trust in that we haven't even scratched the surface. Again, reflecting on our lived experience at Lift Economy, working with a lot of communitarian type projects, worker-owned cooperatives, etc., we see people who get involved in day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, some type of deliberative collective decision making. It actually begins to change them as humans, how they interact with their family, how they interact in their neighborhood and their community, feeling the courage to say, yeah, we can come to a collective alignment here. I know how to facilitate a conversation where we can stand side by side and look at an issue together, even if it seems we're coming from differences of perspective. I don't think we've even approached what's possible. It's inspiring to me to know the work that you and your team members and colleagues are doing to uplift this and facilitate these processes. And for listeners who might be familiar with some of the other content that Next Economy Now has explored, there is this, I think, potential extraordinarily powerful liberatory potential in participatory budgeting for those who may be stuck on this. There's this one critique of, Anand Giridharadas wrote a great book about winner takes all and the mentality of like business and enterprise must be the answer. And then those who are in that world, in that milieu, they create wealth, and then philanthropically, they'll do things outside of the functions of government to address the needs of people, which through the lens of that book is clearly a powerful critique that that's not working. A lot of people then ask, well, what is the alternative? And he'll say, well, re-engaging with government, so taxation, progressive taxation, and so forth, to increase the resources of the state or the society. But then those who critique the state have a very valid critique that the state has been maybe highly influenced or corrupted by special interests and the exploitation economy, or isn't actually responding, is not inclusive of those who have been left out and cut out by force. Participatory budgeting gives us a glimpse into a world where the state is actually functioning and meeting the needs of community, of the people. And that to me is like the response that somebody could say. So anybody's like, oh, well, I don't like the winner takes all, but isn't business or enterprise the only way we see outcomes potentially changing? We can transform on all levels. So we can transform how enterprise works with structural change there. Simultaneously, we can change how the state operates. And so the work that you're doing to enlighten us as to what's possible there is, like, I think, super important to envision a liberatory future. How do people get involved in PB, or what are some of the avenues? I'm sure there's multiple ways. I'm curious how.
Well, first of all, I'm like, heck yeah. And secondly, I do think that the ways that people get involved are to start asking some of those questions, right? Some of these questions that we're asking now around what's possible, right? And what can I practice? And how do I set myself up to practice some things on a big and small scale? And so if you're listening to this and you're a person, I don't know, at an organization that wants to practice some participatory democracy with your team, right? Or if you want to practice some of this with some members of your family or your co-op, then I think that there's an opportunity to do that, right? To say, where can we make some decisions together? I think that's a really great place to begin practicing this and building some muscles toward that. I think if you visit our website at participatorybudgeting.org, you might get some tools that might help you understand what it looks like to practice this at scale. If you're a person that's thinking, man, maybe I could do this in my city, town, or county, and I want to visualize kind of what this looks like, there may be some tools to help you practice it. I also think that practicing in community is really important. And so if folks want to get their minds around what participatory budgeting is, yes, visit the website, follow some of the information that we put out, but we have a community of practice. We have a Democracy Beyond Elections coalition. And this is a coalition of movement-based, we like to call them movers and shakers, change makers across the country that are really thinking about community-led decision-making that is equitable, accessible, and significant. And I would describe this space as a bit of a lab. They're building models like a participatory policy-making model. They're doing pilots across the country. They just launched a national campaign around how ARPA funds should and could be redistributed. And so folks out there listening may remember there's like something like $1.9 trillion as part of this package, and something like $350 billion go to local and state municipalities. And what this campaign from the DBE coalition is really focused on is ensuring that some of those dollars are decided on by the communities that they're intended to impact. And so if you want to learn more about that work or how to be involved in it, check out democracybeyondelections.org. But I think those are some ways. But I would just say, I think the best way to get involved with this work, if you want to do participatory budgeting, if you want to vision what participatory democracy could offer you or your community, is to take one step toward practicing.
I love it. And one of the things that I'm learning more about the participatory budgeting project itself as an organization, you mentioned earlier the shared leadership, the team, and the practice, is that your work is actually prefigurative of the future that you're building. Can you comment a little bit about how your team practices, or just I'm just curious if you could share a little bit on the inside.
I love that. You're like, Kevin, you're like really asking me, Shari, do you practice what you preach? And absolutely, yes, we do. And I think it's actually really important that we do. So as an organization that is working out in the world to foster community-led decision-making and to grow, we think it's incumbent upon us to practice that. And maybe that allows us to be closer to innovating and learning with folks that we're serving or in partnership with as well. So there's that piece, right? And there's also the opportunities that it offers. Like maybe if we practice some community-led decision-making or community leadership, it's actually expansive, right? These structures that stop with one person at the top, like I've been an executive director at organizations a couple times over. And I will say that it is not a sustainable structure or system. I don't think that it is effective. I don't think that it reflects what we talk about in terms of dynamic leadership, right? I don't think it sets people up for having a close relationship to change. I don't think that it sets folks up to be onboarded to multiple skill sets, or if something happens, right, it creates a pretty inefficient model for how an organization remains functional, right? If there's so much reliance on one person. And so at the Participatory Budgeting Project, we actually practice a shared leadership structure that is modeled after a sociocratic framework. And I know that's a lot of words, right? You're hearing shared leadership, you're hearing sociocratic framework. Really what this means is that we organize in circles. And there's a leadership team and a leadership circle. And we have some very clear responsibilities around what we decide and do and coach each other on, and systems that we build. That also allows us to take time off and live full lives and show up at work really well because we've invested in this trust, and that proliferates our team and other circles, right? If we have a programmatic circle, if we have a finance and management circle, it allows folks to also show up and coach each other and be whole and make decisions together. And I will say that this is an investment, an intentional investment from our team. And I think it's incredibly important, and it's allowing us to grow deep relationships with each other. I've never been happier in my relationships and leadership than the relationships that I have with Cristania De Leon and Christina Banks, the other co-executive directors at PBP. I think we are practicing what I hope organizations of the future look like right now. And I think we're learning so much and developing such important skills to function in that future. And so, yeah, we're practicing it. I hope that you practice it. That reminds me, Kevin, we actually have a toolkit. We actually launched a cohort for folks to do some decision-making in their organizations. It was a PB for Orgs toolkit, or a PB for Orgs cohort rather, and 14 individuals from different organizations joined and built roadmaps for their organizations to use participatory budgeting inside of their entities to make decisions about their internal budgets. And so not only are we practicing it, but we're inviting other folks to practice with us as well.
Super inspiring. I see the ripples out from the integrity and commitment to which you're bringing the work that you're doing as an organization, how that affects other organizations, and then their lives, their schools, their neighborhoods, their communities, and potentially society at large, building up these skills. There's so many things you could do with your life, and I didn't even get to ask you about the schooling on health and anatomy, and there's so many other things that I know are alive in you and your lived experience. I focus so much on participatory budgeting, but I'm just so grateful for the commitment of your life energy to this really important work. It's, as far as we can tell, a really critical piece. There's other pieces, yes, it's all a constellation of things that need to happen. But what you're co-leading and developing and all that you're learning and sharing is very important. And at Lift Economy and the Next Economy Now, we're very grateful for everything that you're doing.
Thank you so much. And it's really an honor to be a member of this ecosystem with you that is so committed to building the futures that serve us now.
Shari, is there anything else you want to leave the Next Economy Now listeners with before we part today?
I think the thing that I'll just share with our listeners as we wrap up here is, in practicing, you realize things that you might be very good at, and you might realize some areas where you can grow. And I would just encourage listeners to find those spaces of practice where you can grow. And I think where we grow together is where we make the most change.
Thank you.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Before you go, we wanted to let you know that our spring cohort of the Next Economy MBA begins on March 26th. If you're an entrepreneur seeking to create a business that works for all life, a member of a team looking to transition your organization into one that is more regenerative and democratic, or someone who's considering a career or livelihood transition and embodiment with your values, we designed this course for you. Over this 9-month learning journey, you'll have the chance to learn practical skills around business and life design based on our work with over 250 social enterprises. In addition to live sessions, you can deepen your experience and practice with special sessions, affinity groups, and connections with over 500 alumni who have participated in the course. Interested in learning more? Visit lifteconomy.com/MBA to view our course curriculum and sign up for a free intro with one of our facilitators. If you're ready to sign up, you can use the code PODCASTMBA to save 10% on tuition. We hope you'll join us.